Okay, hi everyone. My name is Claire, and I am very excited to talk about the lead smelter located in Torreón, Mexico, and talk about its detrimental effects on the community. Firstly, this is just a brief overview of what the presentation will include. I'll go over the purpose and objectives to understand why the lead smelter in Torreón is a significant concern. And then we'll move into the efforts of the smelter to explore the various impacts it had created. Next are the environmental and health impact sections, where I'll delve further to explore what exactly was going on with the environment and the health of individuals. In the aftermath section, I'll discuss efforts made to recover and the consequences that are still being faced today. And then finally, I'll give a brief summary of everything that was presented and show a list of sources I used. So the first objective of this presentation is to understand how the lead smelter led to widespread poisoning, which has been a significant concern for the people in Torreón, and we'll explore the root causes of this issue and discuss how it affects the community environment. The second objective is to provide an in-depth understanding of the environmental and health impacts associated with the lead poisoning from the smelter. Here I want to examine how the smelter affected the air, water, and soil, and then discuss harmful effects on the human body. The third objective is to explore the aftermath of the lead smelter and the measures that have been taken since to mitigate the damage. I want to discuss here the challenges faced by the community and the government and how they responded to the crisis. And then finally, my hope is just that this presentation will also encourage future precautionary actions and other prevention measures to avoid similar incidents in the future. So the Torreón smelter was the largest of its kind in all of Mexico, and it opened up in 1930. Since its opening, it was emitting large amounts of lead and other pollutants. So it wasn't before long when community members started to complain about the pollution and the health impacts that they were seeing within the community. Unfortunately, it wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that studies were finally conducted to prove the smelter's emissions were the source of high lead level exposure among children in the surrounding areas. And then, of course, the discovery of these negative impacts is what finally led to the smelter's closure in 1999. So I want to take a look here at Figure 1. This is a pie chart that gives you a visual representation of the scale of the Torreón smelter and its impact on Mexico's lead production. You can see the smelter, or METMEX, accounted for 60% of Mexico's entire lead production. And this is huge. So I hope it gives you just an idea of how big this smelter was. But what I also wanted this to point out was just how much would have been emitted from a smelter of this scale. So when you see how much lead the METMEX smelter accounted for, it's really hard to imagine what it would have been like for the surrounding community. Okay, so now let's look at the environmental impacts, keeping in mind the scale of emissions being produced just from the pie chart we just saw. All the lead dust that was being emitted from the smelter was just constantly being accumulated through the Torreón community. So high levels of lead had become prominent in the air, in the soil, in our water, and this contamination didn't just affect the individuals of the community, but the plants and animals as well. A lot of the studies that had come out in the 80s and 90s were really focused on the human health impacts, but it is important to keep in mind that the lead pollution had far-reaching consequences for the entire ecosystem in the surrounding areas. So Figure 2 is comprised of this spatial analysis, and this here is just a map of Torreón. And I want you to pay close attention to the different colored shapes. They'll also be important for Figure 3 coming up. So the big red dot is the METMEX smelter, and you can see that there are inhabitants, pretty much all the way around it. And the study that had done this spatial analysis wanted to focus on lead levels of school-age children. So the yellow dots here actually represent schools, and then the blue dots are sites where the soil was sampled. Again, just keeping in mind how much lead, the smelter was producing, and then look at how close the community and these schools were. Okay, so let's look at Figure 3. This is a timeline of the lead levels from the samples that were taken in the blue dots that we just saw. And so what we see is that since the smelter's closure in 1999, lead levels have been continuously decreasing. And this might seem like great news, and it is definitely progress. I don't want to take away from that. But what I want to point out here is that the EPA states that the safe threshold for lead in soil is 400 parts per million. But even in 2006 here, 7 years after the smelter had closed, the community still had unsafe lead levels in their soil. So they're still feeling, these effects from the smelter 7 years later. All right, I want to step out of the environmental impacts and look at some of the health impacts. So, what exactly does lead mean to us? Lead is a potent environmental toxin that can have harmful effects on almost every system in the body. So even the smallest amounts can be really, really harmful. Anything above 5 micrograms per deciliter can have serious health consequences. But in addition to being highly potent, exposure to lead is also cumulative. And this means that the effects of lead exposure build up over time. Okay, let's look at figure 4. Here we have a bar graph that shows the blood levels for a sample of children that were between the ages of 0 and 18 and lived in Torreón. We can see that there is a sample taken every year from 1998, which would have been 1 year before the smelter closed, all the way till 2010, which is 11 years after. What I want to point out here is where the safe level of lead in blood falls, this red line, and now we can see that it wasn't until 2008, 9, and 10 when the blood levels for these children became acceptable. But even then, they're like really right on that line. So here, even 11 years after the closure, children of the community were still facing negative health consequences. And like I said, this is just a subset. This is just a sample of children, so this doesn't even include everyone else within the community. Okay, so let's move into the aftermath and briefly go over what was being done to mitigate the damage after METMEX's closure. If we look here at figure 5, we just see a table that consists of all mitigation efforts, and several measures were taken to try and address the environmental health impacts of the smelter's operation. And these included soil remediation, water treatment, public education, health monitoring, and legal action. And we can kind of see on this table just exactly what all of those meant. But keep in mind, even though there were a lot of efforts to try and mitigate the damage, again, what we just saw in the environmental and health impacts is that people are still facing the repercussions today. Okay, so I'm going to bring us to the summary. And we just learned how big of a significant environmental disaster the Torreón smelter was and the severe health and environmental impacts it caused. And like I said, although response efforts were made to mitigate its effects, unfortunately, negative consequences are still being dealt with today as individuals of the community and the environment continue to deal with the repercussions. All right, so that brings us to the end here. This slide is just references for my sources of information. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.